Before there was an empire, there was a child left alone on a steppe. In the year 1162, in the vast grasslands north of the Gobi Desert, a boy was born to the chief of a minor Mongol clan. His name was Temüjin. His father was poisoned by enemies before the boy had learned to ride. His clan abandoned him and his family, leaving them to survive alone on the open steppe without herds, without allies, without protection. He ate roots and wild berries. He hunted mice. He was captured by a rival clan and wore a wooden collar as a slave. By every measure of the world he had been born into, Temüjin should have died young, forgotten, one more casualty, the endless tribal violence that had consumed the Mongolian steppe for centuries. He did not die. He survived, and in surviving he learned something about power, loyalty, and human nature that would eventually allow him to build the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. The Mongolian steppe, in the late 12th century, was a world of almost constant warfare. Dozens of tribes, Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Karats, and others, competed for grazing land, horses, and survival in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. The climate was extreme, brutal winters of -40 degrees, scorching summers, unpredictable droughts that could destroy a herd and starve a family in a single season. The people who lived here were among the most skilled horsemen in human history, capable of riding before they could walk, accurate with a composite bow at full gallop, accustomed to hardship from birth. But they were divided, perpetually at war with one another, raiding each other's herds, stealing each other's women, and killing each other's children in cycles of revenge that had no end. This fragmented, violent world was the crucible in which Temüjin was forged, and it was exactly this world he would one day unite. Temüjin's rise was neither swift nor inevitable. It took decades of patient alliance building, military innovation, and ruthless elimination of rivals. His first great ally was Redrew, the powerful Khan of the Kharat tribe, who became a father figure and patron. His first great friend was Jamuka, a blood brother with whom he swore eternal loyalty and whom he would eventually have to destroy. Temüjin understood instinctively what no Mongol leader before him had fully grasped: that the tribal system of loyalty based on kinship was the fundamental source of steppe weakness. Tribes united against a common enemy, but dissolved back into their constituent clans. The moment the enemy was defeated, Temüjin began replacing kinship loyalty with personal loyalty to himself. He promoted men not because of their birth, but because of their ability. He rewarded soldiers who showed courage, regardless of their tribe. He integrated defeated enemies into his own forces, rather than killing them wholesale if they submitted. Those who resisted were destroyed without mercy. Those who submitted were absorbed and became Mongols. The military system Temüjin built was unlike anything the steppe had produced before. It was organized on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, the Tumen. These units were deliberately composed of men from different tribes, breaking the old clan loyalties and creating new loyalties to the unit and its commander. Discipline was absolute and enforced by death. Retreat without orders was punishable by execution, not just of the individual, but of his entire unit of 10. But the rewards for service were equally radical: a share of all plunder distributed according to rank and merit, promotion based on demonstrated ability rather than birth, and the personal protection of the Khan himself. Temüjin created the first meritocratic army in Mongolian history, and it would prove to be the most effective military force the medieval world had ever seen. By 1206, Temüjin had done what no one before him had accomplished. He had united all the Mongol and most of the Turkic tribes of the eastern steppe under his single authority. At a great assembly, a Kurultai, held on the banks of the Onon River, the assembled tribal leaders proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, or more precisely, the Shah ruler, the Khan of Khans, whose authority extended in all directions like the sea. He was approximately 44 years old. He had survived slavery, abandonment, and decades of warfare to stand at the summit of the most formidable military society on earth. And he was not finished. He had unified the steppe. Now he would turn his attention outward, and the world beyond the steppe had no idea what was coming. The first major target was the Shishi Kingdom of northwestern China, a Tangut state, controlled key Silk Road trade routes, and had long been accustomed to dealing with steppe nomads from a position of relative security behind its walls and deserts. The Mongols had no experience with siege warfare. They had never needed it, but Genghis Khan was not a man who accepted the limitations of his current capabilities. He observed, he learned, and he adapted. The Shishak campaigns from 1205 to 1209 forced the Mongols to develop entirely new military capabilities, siege engineering, the use of Chinese and Persian technical experts, the construction of siege towers and catapults, the diversion of rivers to flood fortifications. By the time the Shishak king submitted and agreed to become a vassal, the Mongol army had transformed itself from a purely cavalry force into a combined arms military machine capable of taking fortified cities. The Jin dynasty of northern China was the next and far greater challenge. The Jin, descendants of the Jurchen people, who had conquered northern China from the Song dynasty decades earlier, commanded an army of perhaps 400,000 men, controlled some of the most heavily fortified cities in the world, and had access to sophisticated military technology, including gunpowder weapons. They also had a long history of manipulating steppe peoples against each other, a strategy that had kept northern China safe from nomadic conquest for generations. Genghis Khan invaded in 1211 with an army of perhaps 100,000 cavalry. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a decade-long campaign of extraordinary complexity. The Mongols could not simply defeat the Jin in open battle and expect them to surrender. There were too many cities, too much territory, too many soldiers. Instead, Genghis systematically destroyed the Jin's ability to resist, devastating agricultural regions, to cut off food supplies, defeating Jin armies in the field, capturing and using Jin engineers at administrating to Jin subjects that their dynasty could no longer protect. In 1215, the great Jin capital of Zhongdu, on the site of modern Beijing, fell to the Mongols. The Jin dynasty would not be fully extinguished until 1234, after Genghis himself was gone, but the campaign had demonstrated that even the greatest fortified civilizations in the world were not safe from the storm that had emerged from the northern steppe. While the Chinese campaigns continued, Genghis Khan turned westward, and what followed would become one of the most catastrophic events in the history of the Islamic world. The Khwarazmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, stretched from Persia through Central Asia to the borders of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the world, controlling the Eastern Silk Road and commanding an army of perhaps 400,000 men. Genghis Khan initially approached the Khwarazmian Empire as a trading partner, sending a large caravan of merchants and a diplomatic embassy to open relations. The Shah, mistrustful and arrogant, made a catastrophic decision. He ordered the caravan seized, the merchants executed, and the ambassadors humiliated or killed. It was the worst diplomatic decision in the history of the medieval world. Genghis Khan, who regarded the killing of ambassadors as one of the gravest possible offenses, mobilized his full army for a war of total annihilation. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire in 1219 and 1220 was a campaign of stunning strategic brilliance and almost incomprehensible destructiveness. The Shah expected the Mongols to advance along predictable routes and distributed his forces across his numerous cities to defend them individually. Genghis instead divided his army into multiple columns operating simultaneously across an enormous front. The general Jibbe led one force through the passes of the Hindu Kush. The general Subutai led another in a great sweeping arc. Genghis himself led the main force directly toward Samarkand, the empire's greatest city. Before he reached it, he sent a separate force under his sons to appear behind the Shah's army, cutting off retreat. The Shah's strategy of distributed defense collapsed. His forces were defeated in detail. City after city fell: Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Herat. The populations of cities that resisted or were massacred with a thoroughness that contemporaries struggled to describe. Merv, one of the great cities of the medieval world, with a population estimated at perhaps several 100,000, was destroyed so completely that a Persian chronicler wrote that a traveler passing through years later would have found no sign that human beings had ever lived there. The terror was not accidental, it was strategic. Genghis Khan understood that cities, which surrendered immediately, were spared and absorbed into the empire's administrative structure. Cities that resisted were destroyed as a demonstration to every other city in the region of the cost of resistance. The psychology was calculated with cold precision: surrender and live, resist and die. The strategy worked with horrifying efficiency. As the Mongol columns advanced, cities surrendered without fighting, governors opened their gates, populations prostrated themselves, hoping that submission would buy survival. Sometimes it did. Sometimes, for reasons that were not always clear to the surviving inhabitants, it did not. The unpredictability of Mongol mercy was itself a weapon, keeping populations in a state of paralytic terror that made organized resistance almost impossible. The human cost of the Mongol conquests in Central Asia was staggering and permanent. Modern demographic historians estimate that the population of Iran alone may have fallen by as much as 75% during the Mongol period. Cities that had been centers of Islamic scholarship, art, and commerce for centuries were reduced to rubble and remained depopulated for generations. The great irrigation systems of Mesopotamia and Central Asia, which had sustained dense agricultural populations since antiquity, were destroyed, some deliberately, some simply abandoned, and were never fully restored. The Mongol invasion of Central Asia and Persia set back the economic and demographic development of the region by centuries. This was not just conquest. It was a civilizational rupture whose effects are still visible in the historical record. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a campaign against the Shah, who had refused to provide troops for the Khwarazmian campaign and were being punished for it. The cause of his death is uncertain: a fall from a horse, an arrow wound, an illness, or some combination of these. He was approximately 65 years old. He had not conquered the world, not quite, but he had created the machinery, but do so after his death. Before he died, he divided his empire among his 4 sons, Yoki, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. Ogedei was named the Great Khan, the supreme authority over the others. The division was intended to prevent the fratricidal conflicts that had torn apart every previous steppe empire. Whether it succeeded is debatable. Mongol history after Genghis is full of succession crises, civil wars, but it did allow the empire to continue expanding for another generation with astonishing effectiveness. Under Ogedei Khan, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent of coordinated expansion. To the east, the Jin dynasty was finally destroyed in 1234. Korea was conquered. The southern Song dynasty of China came under sustained pressure that would eventually lead to its destruction under Kublai Khan. To the west, a campaign of breathtaking ambition was launched in 1236 under the command of Batu Khan and the military genius of Subutai, widely regarded as the greatest purely military mind of the medieval world. This western campaign would carry the Mongol Empire to the shores of the Adriatic Sea. The Rus principalities of what is now Russia fell one by one: Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Kiev. Kiev, one of the greatest cities of medieval Europe, and the cultural heart of Orthodox Slavic civilization, was destroyed in a papal emissary passing through the ruins 2 years later wrote that he could barely count the skulls and bones of the dead. The Mongols crossed into Poland and Hungary in 1241, defeating every army sent against them. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a combined force of Polish and German knights was annihilated. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, the Hungarian royal army was destroyed. Nothing stood between the Mongols and the Atlantic Ocean. And then, in December 1241, Genghis Khan died in Mongolia. Mongol commanders in Europe, including Batu and Subutai, turned back to participate in the Kurultai that would select a new great Khan. Whether Ogedai's death saved Western Europe from Mongol conquest has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue that Subutai's forces were overextended and that Western Europe's castle-based military culture would have made conquest extremely difficult. Others point out that Subutai had defeated every opponent he had faced, from China to Poland, and that the death of Ogedai was the only thing that stopped an advance that showed no signs of slowing. The question cannot be answered with certainty. What is certain is that the Mongols did not return to Western Europe in force, and that the states of the West had been unable to stop them when they did advance. The most dramatic and consequential check on Mongol expansion came not in Europe, but in the Middle East, at the Battle of Ain Jalut. The Mongol Ilkhanate, under Hulagu Khan, had already destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, sacking Baghdad in 1258 and killing the last Abbasid Caliph, an event of enormous symbolic significance to the Islamic world, ending an institution that had existed for 5 centuries. Damascus had fallen. Egypt appeared to be next. But at Ain Jalut, in what is now northern Israel, a Mamluk army from Egypt met the Mongol advance force and defeated it decisively. It was the first significant battlefield defeat the Mongols had suffered in decades, and it stopped the western expansion of the Ilkhanate permanently. The Mamluks, themselves slave soldiers Central Asian Turkic origin, learned from Mongol tactics and turned those tactics against their teachers. The Mongol tide had found its limit. The empire that Genghis Khan built did not last as a unified entity. By the late 13th century, it had fractured into 4 major successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde on the Western Steppe, each increasingly influenced by the cult and religion of the peoples they ruled. The Yuan dynasty adopted Chinese governance structures and eventually converted to Buddhism. The Ilkhanate converted to Islam. The Golden Horde also became Muslim. The Chagatai Khanate remained the most traditionally Mongol, maintaining steppe nomadic culture longest. These successor states competed and fought with each other, even as they continued to govern vast populations. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, that existed during the empire's peak in the mid-13th century, had enabled unprecedented commerce and communication across Eurasia, connecting China and Europe through a network of protected trade routes. It was during this period that Marco Polo traveled to China, that Chinese technologies, including printing and gunpowder, moved westward, that plague, the Black Death, may have spread along the same routes, that carried silk and spices, with consequences for Europe that would reshape the medieval. The legacy of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is one of the most contested questions in history. The destruction was real and immense. Estimates of the total death toll from Mongol conquests range from 20 million to 40 million people, a significant fraction of the entire world population at the time. Entire civilizations were disrupted or destroyed. The Islamic world never fully recovered the cultural and intellectual vitality it had possessed before the Mongol invasions. The Rus principalities emerged from Mongol rule 2 centuries later as a different civilization than they had been before, more centralized, more authoritarian, shaped in ways both obvious and subtle by the experience of subjugation. Central Asia, which had been one of the most densely populated and culturally rich regions in the world, remained depopulated and economically diminished for generations. These costs are not abstractions. They represent millions of individual human lives cut short, libraries burned, cities reduced to ash, knowledge lost, potential destroyed. And yet the Mongol Empire was not only destruction. It created the largest free trade zone in the pre-modern world, enabling the movement of goods, ideas, people, and technologies across the full breadth of Eurasia on a scale that had never been possible before. The administrative systems the Mongols developed, using conquered people's expertise rather than imposing their own, employing Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Confucians in their bureaucracy based on ability rather than faith, establishing a postal relay system that could carry messages across the empire in days, were sophisticated and in some ways remarkably tolerant. Genghis Khan himself practiced a religious pluralism unusual for his era, consulting shamans, Buddhist monks, Taoist sages, and Muslim scholars with equal curiosity. He issued decrees of religious toleration in conquered territories. He built an empire in which a Venetian merchant could travel safely from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, and Genghis Khan died as he had lived, in the field, in motion, still campaigning at an age when most men of his era were long dead. He ordered that his tomb be unmarked, and to this day, it has never been found with certainty, despite numerous searches. His body was carried back to Mongolia by an escort that killed everyone who saw the procession, ensuring that the location of his burial would remain secret. It has. Somewhere in the Khenti Mountains of northeastern Mongolia, the man who conquered more of the world than any other individual in history lies in unmarked earth, unknown and undisturbed, returned to the steppe that made him. What he left behind was a world permanently altered. The map of Eurasia drawn in 1300 was fundamentally different from the map of 1200, different borders, different populations, different power structures, different trade routes, different religious balances. Nations that exist today were shaped by Mongol conquest. Russia, Iran, China, Korea, and dozens of others bear the marks of the storm that swept out of the northern steppe in the early 13th century. The Mongol Empire lasted less than 2 centuries as a unified entity. Its effects have lasted 800 years and are not finished yet. The boy who ate roots on the steppe, who wore a slave's collar, who was abandoned by his clan and left to die, that boy became the most consequential conqueror in human history. Not because he was superhuman, not because he was blessed by destiny, but because he was harder, smarter, more adaptable, and more ruthlessly focused than any opponent he ever faced. He looked at a world of fragmented warring tribes and saw an empire. He looked at cities behind walls and learned how to breach them. He looked at civilizations that had existed for 1,000 years and decided they were obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. History has never fully decided whether Genghis Khan was a catastrophe that befell the world or a force that, for all its violence, drove the world forward into a new era of connection and exchange. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps the honest answer is that the distinction between catastrophe and transformation is one that history rarely makes cleanly, and that the Mongol storm was, like all the great disruptions of human civilization, both destroyer and maker at once, leaving behind a world that was worse in many ways and different in all ways from the one it had found.